Hey, deserving listeners, this is chapter 13. I think the last chapter in our Duggar deep dive. Let's get into it. My name is Dr. Kirk Honda. I'm a therapist and a professor.
My name is Humberto Castañeda, and I use my hands for important things.
So let's get into ATI. So this is the Advanced Training Institute within IBLP, which the Duggars were a part of and used. And it is the homeschooling program that is pretty elaborate and has some very interesting aspects to it. So let's get into ATI. And I think it's, again, as I said earlier, there's nothing wrong with having a religion or a belief system, but there is something wrong when those beliefs or that religion harms people, and particularly kids, right? To educate, quote unquote, kids in a way that is giving them false, I don't know, I would imagine knowingly giving them propaganda, because
they justify it, right? They're giving them the right information.
Yeah.
They're saving their souls. They're making it so they can procreate better and survive better. And
yeah. So it's harmful.
All for their good.
It's harmful. It's false information. It is unnecessary. There are plenty of Christian kids who go to public school and take all the regular classes. That doesn't have to threaten your religion. You just decided that and maybe needed to have total control or more control over your people. But anyway, so ATI is the homeschooling program. And the other thing that I just want to mention up front is that there seems to be, and I learned this a long time ago, that there is very little government monitoring of children's education. Like I grew up, I thought people said this, that if I didn't go to school for a while. Yeah, there's truant officers. Remember hearing about that?
Right.
As far as I know, and I worked with a lot of families who had kids who were truant and whatnot, and I never met a truant officer. You just had the sense that there was this guy who just roamed around in an old Plymouth, and smoked cigarettes and was just looking for truant kids that he could rough them up and bring them back to school. Another aspect, I just figured that, let's say a family moves to another town and the parents, for whatever reason, just decide not to enroll their kids in school. I figured that the government or police or the truant officers or someone would come down on the family like a ton of rocks. I figured that there's just no way. But the first time I realized that this was not the case was when I started working with families and kids that were truant. And I would have kids that hadn't been in schools for a couple years.
Ooh.
Not because of the parents, but because the kid was just defying rules and didn't want to go to school. Because that was the other thing. I figured that
for a couple of years,
if you didn't go to school, that something horrible would happen to you, right? That you'd go to prison, or I don't know, just something, or they would literally just drag you to school. I just figured there's got to be, but no, long story short, if a kid really wants to not go to school, or when they're at school to ditch school and not go back, they can, and some do. And what I would see is that once the kid would cross that threshold and find out that there's really no consequences, and they get they truly get to avoid school and all the negative things about it, then it's really hard to get them to go back. Sure. You know what I mean? Anyway.
They've seen through the thin veil.
Yeah. And we reviewed a case maybe a year ago or something of a kid who was being raised by his abusive dad, right? And we found out through the documentary that the mom didn't, the dad stole the kid when he was young, brought him to another community or state or something, and I believe never enrolled him in school or something, right?
Yeah.
And you would just think
imagine that someone's knocking at that door.
Like there's some big database of like, hey, this kid has a birth certificate, but we don't see him in school.
So they hit the red button, the truant officers slide down the pole.
Yeah.
We're on our way.
Right. Doesn't exist. And in relation to IBLP and ATI and the Duggars, you have whole swaths of people, millions of kids being homeschooled in a system that would be pretty easy to review. I mean, at least you could do that, right? Like you have a government officer that's like says, "Hey, show me your program." And IBLP and ATI, it was public to the point where I have access to it. I read a lot of it, you know what I mean? And you would just think that someone in the government would be like, no, this is not science-based. It's propaganda. It's culty, and you can't. It's illegal. We're going to throw all you parents in prison if you continue, or something, or you're going to throw ATI in prison, or something. But no, you could say, well, we want to live in a free country, so da-da-da. But you would think there would be some protections. But I just imagine if the government, if Biden were to support some measure that sent the jackbooted thugs into homes of good Christian homes,
it'd be all over.
And interfered with the homeschooling, there'd be riots. But anyway, so I read a fair amount of the wisdom booklets. So did you. These are the textbooks that this program uses, and I think there were like 60 or 70 of them. When I found them, I sent them to you.
Yeah.
And I just thought how amazing it is that we have access to this. And it seems to progress through age. So the first one is maybe for first graders, and the last one is maybe for 12th graders or something, because it gets more sophisticated as the number goes higher. Seemingly.
Yeah, you start doing calculus and advanced chemistry.
Yeah. Well, the science does get more advanced, but let's talk about that. So the first thing I'll say, the summary that I got from reading these is that it's not so much of an educational tool as much as it is propaganda for IBLP. It's not even necessarily propaganda for Christianity. It's really trying to indoctrinate these kids on a constant basis on the kind of odd beliefs that IBLP has, in addition to Christianity as a whole. Like, for example, I was surprised at how much actual science and actual facts there are in these books. There are actual science facts and math facts and chemistry and biology and history. But everything, and I mean everything, is intertwined with the cult. So, for example, it's kind of hard to imagine, like, well, how do you do that? Well, in my opinion, it's masterful. I can see why IBLP was such a thing and why ATI lasted for so many decades, because whoever or whatever team put this together, it's so slick and so convincing, especially if you had no outside influence. So, for example, they talk about the science of eyes. This is in one of the very first books, so maybe it's for like second, third graders or something. And they're talking about sight and eyes, and they talk about, lenses and photons or whatever, and the rods and the cones, stuff that you learned in school. But then they transition to my eyes, it looks ridiculous. It's a total right turn. But to people that don't know, you can see how it just naturally goes in. And it transitions into, quote, how do these disorders of sight, so they're listing different disorders of sight, how do these disorders of sight apply to errors in spiritual perception? Berto, what do you think?
That makes sense. Basically, what's awesomely clever, so horrible, is that you have to give the credibility first. The credibility comes from these complex scientific bits and pieces. Like, oh, I didn't know my eye had these little cells in them and they're photons. Well, geez, you learn something new every day. And that preps you for the rest of the story, which is, and this helps us explain sin. This helps us explain,
right.
Which, and honestly, given that no one at that age or at those levels is going to have the ability to be skeptical about what even photons are or whatever, it's so easy to be like, well, photons come directly from the heavens, or darkness is devoid of God's light because, and then...
Yeah, but this example is indicative of a lot of the lessons that I saw. They don't necessarily say that. That's the genius of it, because I think for a lot of these kids, or the authors, I think they knew, look, if we could, we would just say that everything comes from God. But there is science, and a lot of these kids are going to learn about it. So how do we allow for that so that the cult members can say, you don't want to put the cult member in a situation where they're easily pulled out of the cult, where they're like,
sure,
but science? So they acknowledge science, but they interweave, they always bring it back to the cult. So they talk about the science of the eyes and they don't attribute it to God at all. They just laid out the facts. A lot of the wisdom books were like that. And I was really surprised by that. But very quickly, and I'm talking, the lesson for sight might be 1 page.
Yeah.
And they're cramming a lot of shit in there. And by the end of the page, in this, sort of textbooky fonts, it says, how do these disorders of sight apply to errors in spiritual perception? So you can, the vision in my head is you have a teacher, the parents who are teaching this, right? And they, it probably takes 3 to 7 minutes to go over the science. And then you get to this question, because they lay out like a blurred vision or being myopic or astigmatism or something. They go over those kinds of things, or being colorblind. And then you can imagine the parents, so it doesn't take very long to teach that, so to speak. Then you ask, okay, well, how do these disorders of sight, like being colorblind or myopic, apply to errors in spiritual perception? And I'm guessing that that's the rest of the day for school, is just talking about how, myopia is, being short-sighted, if that's what it is, I forget. Even though that's what I have severely. I can't even see the big E at the top. I'm so myopic or so nearsighted that I they say, read the first line that you say, nothing. Did you put it up yet? I can't even. Anyway. So, being short-sighted, that's like not seeing that God is the best, and that Jesus died for our sins, and that Dad is in control of everything. You can imagine that those are the conversations very quickly getting away from the science of the eyes.
It's the same thing with, like, I'm sure they cover the Big Bang. That's one of the favorites, right? And it's like, and that shows us that there was a beginning, and then that's a whole conversation right there. It's very interesting. It's like you present the believable, facts, and to your point, if they happen to, they're not supposed to, but if they happen to have a conversation with someone from the outside world, that they have a couple levels of depth where they can be like, oh, okay, well, I know what I'm talking about, because I do know. No, you're wrong. I do know about rods and cones. It's just what you don't know about is how that applies to your inner psyche, and that inner psyche is your soul, and blah, blah, blah. Yeah.
Right. And how it relates to IBLP and the specifics of that, and how it can keep people under control. Another example.
By the way, such an interesting association that physical defects are related to spiritual defects.
Right. You can imagine that they would apply this to non-cult members. They would say, well, we have 20/20 vision regarding spiritual matters. They don't, because you saw that high school girl who was wearing a shirt where you could see her elbows, literally. Another example that I found was, I think that this was later on, so this is more advanced, was they have a lesson on fiber optics, and they talk about how fiber optics work, and it's pretty brief, but it describes it, and there's little illustrations, textbooky illustrations. But then they, at the end, quote, how do fiber optics illustrate the power and accuracy of Christ's Sermon on the Mount? Okay, so the sight disorders, as they put it, and equating them with errors in spiritual perception, okay, the metaphor is there. It's still a problem if this is your science book, but this one, how do fiber optics illustrate the power and accuracy of Christ's Sermon on the Mount?
This is what I was saying, that like photons aren't just photons. They represent the light of God, and the light of God does not deviate. It can travel infinitely long distances and in a straight line, and that's the message from the Mount. It's pure from it, as it leaves the mouth. It doesn't get degraded at all, and it travels in a straight line directly, just like fiber optics.
Are you saying this, or am I just remembering this, that, or both, that the whole lore around Christ's Sermon on the Mount was you could be way in the back of the crowd and hear him clearly? I think I remember that being.
And so much so that you can be now in present time and still hear him clearly.
Right. Now, I started to notice as I was nerding out on these books and the deep dive, and I remember when I was deep diving on these books, it was like 2 a.m. and I'm like, I probably should go to bed, but there's something about these books that and I'm thinking the deep dive doesn't really require you, Kirk, to read all these freaking things. You can get a couple examples, and it's probably representative of the whole series. But I read so many of them, and the reason why is because it reminded me of reading Dungeons and Dragons books when I was a kid. And I don't know what that says.
That's
but
interesting.
It felt like, I guess if I dug deep, it felt like, because with D&D, when I was reading them as a kid, they seemed very arcane to me. It was very, because Gary Gygax wasn't a great writer of rules of his game, and there wasn't a lot of play testing. It was the first edition, and it was geared towards nerds that were 40 who had a lot of time in their hands to...
But wasn't it similar in that it was mixed? Because I remember as a kid having the basic book and reading, and it felt to me like there was some underlying truths there. Like, well, yeah, that is how I would level up my strength or whatever. Like, I just feel like there was like this feeling of like there was some reality to it.
Yeah, maybe especially to a developing kid.
Yeah.
Right? That first there's 5th grade, and then there's 6th grade, and you do more advanced math.
Yeah.
And with the leveling up system, I suppose so. But also the illustrations kind of reminded me.
Oh, okay.
I think that these books just have a feeling of, like I said, if I dig down deep, I think it has a feeling of, it has all the answers. And if you study this thing, and it's hard because it's long and there's a lot of pages and there's a lot of details.
Yeah.
But if you really, and I've heard accounts from cult members of IBLP that have extracted themselves who will say this, that it felt like you had to know all the details, especially with IBLP, because I think they were so homeschool ATI oriented, that as a kid, you could absolutely imagine. I mean, just imagine that your siblings and everyone around you, all your church members, are studying this thing, and it just feels like this is the answer. This has all the answers, and it has science in it.
Right.
It feels like this is the entirety of all the knowledge, and if I figure it all out, then I will know God, or I will know the world, or I will know me, or something. It just kind of has that feel to it. Anyway, so another section was how to style your hair. So it's not just fiber optics and eye science.
Life advice.
Yeah, there's sections on just like, here's how you style your hair. In the middle of a school textbook. And we talked about this before, how their prescripted hairstyle for girls
frozen in the 80s
was frozen in the 80s, and we hypothesized that Bill Gothard's preference for girls froze in the 80s. You know what I mean? There's another section, how to avoid provoking men to sexually assault you. And in that section, I'll save you the details, but there's a lot of details in there. And I'll say that I'm going to make fun of it in a second, but it's pretty well written and pretty convincing, especially if you don't have any outside influence.
Have you ever heard of the modesty pamphlet?
No.
So this is a thing that is circulated around in Christian circles, and it's literally a pamphlet, and it's for women, girls, to learn how to be modest, what to wear, what not to wear, all these things. And it's the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
The whole premise is like, you're at fault, so here's how to prevent being at fault.
Yeah. Not great. And this material is in the homeschooling textbook.
Yeah.
It's the official educational program that is replacing things like math and science and other things they should be learning. Anyway, so in this section, some details, which I'll highlight, is they tell women, I think, but maybe people in general, to not wink.
Not wink?
Don't wink.
Because that's provocative, right? Yeah.
But well, to me, I'm thinking, when was the last time someone winked at someone as a flirtation?
When they were telling them not to wink.
I think that's from like I Love Lucy times.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
The only people I think of when I think of someone who winks is like a dad or a grandpa. They'll say some funny joke and they'll kind of wink at you, right?
Sure.
So he's not supposed to wink? I don't understand.
No, you can't do that.
It's in the textbook.
Wow.
It'd be one thing if some random pastor had this weird idea. It's another thing to have it officially.
Yeah, it's officially inscribed. You can't wink.
Today, the copies of the wisdom books that we looked at, I believe, are the ones that are being published and used today. It's not from the 70s.
Oh, wait. Were they winking when they wrote that?
So another section, which I really want to dive on into, because a lot of the ex-cult members that I listened to podcasts and heard talked about this, but to see it just in black and white in the wisdom book is very disturbing. So it's a section on how to deal with sexual abuse, how to deal with being assaulted sexually. If you have been raped or assaulted, here's what you're supposed to do, essentially, is what's it. Again, now, in a textbook, that's not so bad, right?
Yeah.
To have a segment or a module in school to educate people about this sort of thing, yeah. So bring it up. So there are 4 points that they get into that I want to highlight. The first one is they ask this question, which is, what did the offender damage, is the question. This is all quotes. What did the offender damage? What parts do we damage with bitterness? So it's asking the person, presumably they're speaking directly to someone who was assaulted, who's now reading this. Think of yourself out there. You're 15 years old and you just got assaulted. Again, trigger warning, or not again, but trigger warning. If you are traumatized in this way, you probably don't want to go there unless you talk to your therapist. But if you can handle it, just imagine you're 15, you just got raped by someone in the church or something. And of course, you go to this book. In fact, if you told your parents, they'd be like, read the book. And one of the, this section is saying, what did the offender damage and what parts do we damage with bitterness? What do you think they're saying there, Berto?
Yeah, it's oh my God, there's not even a sentence in between. It's basically, the first question is implying that, how much damage was there really? Can you point to it? And number 2, right away, just not even a breath, it's but what do we damage with bitterness? And this is in the context of having all those other lessons about what do we see with the spirit? What do we see with So now we understand that, we do way more damage to ourselves being bitter about it. You're right. Why do I care so much? I should just let it go, because bitterness is surely worse than this horrible pain and
yeah, I mean, the word bitter is particular, right? It doesn't say what parts do we damage with anger or with resentment or being upset or sadness. Bitter. Frame it as
bitter about it.
Oh, you're so bitter.
Yeah.
I think typically that word is used, and maybe it wasn't used in this way here, but I think people often use the word bitter as a sort of spiteful victim mentality.
Totally.
Mentality.
That's on purpose. The thing you're feeling, just to give it a name, the feeling you're feeling right now is bitterness.
Yeah. So, 2, this is the second section, or another section in this chapter. So the question is, Berto, why did God let it happen? And then, so they give an answer, but what do you think the answer is that they give? Why did God let this happen?
In general, these types of why did God is usually, the main thing is that God really wants us to have free will. And the price for our free will is that we are entitled to make our decisions, both the person that did this to you, but more importantly, you. So God created you. You let this happen. That's what I'm guessing, something like that.
It's more overt than that.
Yeah.
The answer is, quote, so why did God let this rape, why did God let you get raped? Okay.
Yeah.
The answer is immodest dress.
Oh, wow. Okay. They don't even couch it. Indecent
exposure, being out from the protection of your parents.
Oh my gosh.
Being with evil friends. Yeah.
This is fantastic in a grotesque, hideous way, because normally, because I've watched so many debates over the last decade, debates, the Hitchens and stuff. I've watched so many hours of debates. And inevitably, when the question comes up about why would God let horrible things happen, the go-to. It's like, no, you got it wrong. God created us and gave us free will, right? Like that's the go-to. This one, not only do they not couch it, not only they don't remind you of that, they actually say, no, he did let it happen. Mm-hmm. But it's because of your fault. Like it's all your fault.
Right. It's your fault. Another thing that they will say is they'll say, well, it's a test from God. Or another thing that they'll say is that God created the world and free will and wanted us to do with it what we will. And sometimes that results in tragedy for one person or
that's the go-to.
Who didn't deserve it, you know?
Yeah. And it's what's unbelievable to me is that it literally says, no, yes, he did, and it's your fault.
Right. The answer isn't, well, God didn't let it happen.
No. God was basically there.
Yeah. So,
wow.
Okay, third section I want to talk about. They ask a question, and they don't really give an answer, but I want you to think what they're trying to say with this.
Yeah.
The question is, again, they're asking someone who's young, who was raped recently or had been in the past, and they ask the reader, is there any guilt? So what do you think they're saying there?
Yeah, it's basically reinforcing that point of like, it's you, right? Like, isn't there guilt?
Right.
Like,
it doesn't say, is there any guilt? My God, do not feel guilty for being attacked.
No.
It just kind of raises the question.
Are you noticing that there should be guilt? Because there should be.
Yeah.
Because, hint, it's you.
Right.
I mean, that is so unbelievably, like now, this has actually changed my opinion about something.
Oh.
Earlier, I was talking about how, I didn't think that on the inception of the rules making by these people, that they were like trying to like be like, well, how can we get up? This makes me second guess that because it's like, this is so egregiously like proactively and like they're basically acknowledging like, look, let's be honest here. We're going to be touching them, doing all sorts of stuff to them. We got to prep so that they're okay with it. And they realize that it was their fault.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. I could also see this just generating from the general cultural understanding in our culture. The things that are being said here are, of course, diabolical and horrific to us, but we understand that you don't have to be an IBLP cult member as an American to have these kinds of notions, even if you're not religious, just getting away from the God question, bitterness and guilt. People will do this themselves. It's natural that people will actually feel like, they are to blame. So it's not a stretch to imagine that they would also apply that blame to other victims.
I mean, you're not wrong. I guess what makes it so much harder to swallow is that it's inscribed in the homeschooling curriculum.
Yeah. Yeah. People wrote this.
Yeah.
And again, remember that IBLP is a paternalistic, male-centered organization. So it's probably a bunch of dudes.
Right.
And they're writing this and reviewing it and having editors and having people review it and maybe revisions over time as things come out. And they're like, yep, this is what we want to say.
But I'm assuming there's at least a sister or brother section that talks about what to do if you abused someone.
Yeah, no. Number 4 section that I want to highlight is, quote, and they don't really give a response to this, but so I want you to tell me what you think they're getting at. If the abused was not at fault, so if you as the victim were not at fault, then God compensated the abuse with spiritual power.
Yeah, right. Okay. Yeah.
Do you remember hearing this?
Yeah. Well, and this is the other version. So this one I am more familiar with. So like I said, the most common one is, well, God made us free, and that's it. But the other one, which you brought up, is it's a test. It's a thing that's going to help you grow, right? So that's what this one is getting at. It's essentially...
No, I don't think so. I mean, it's in that direction.
So basically, the way I'm reading it is, as we've already established, you're at fault. Let's just be clear about that. In the very unlikely event, maybe that you weren't, asterisk, bottom of the page, in the very unlikely event that you weren't, well, you benefited spiritually. So what may worry? Don't sweat it.
And I wouldn't know this particularly unless I heard from ex-cult members actually talking about this, where it's a gift from God because essentially the message is that if you were assaulted by someone, God compensates you with additional power. Not that you grew.
If you weren't at fault, though.
If you weren't at fault,
which, again, you're likely at fault.
You're pure of heart. You were victimized, and God compensates you by giving you this extra power. It's not really designated as something some sort of.
You just grew spiritually.
Yeah, but it's spiritual power. You're given some,
because you've established a whole curriculum since they were little that lets you believe that actually that might be worth a lot.
Yeah, some sort of that token. And the analogy that I can think of in my own life is that when I grew up in my family, me and my siblings, we frequently had spaghetti. It was always over a huge bed of gohan or rice, edge of plate to edge of plate, just a thick thing of rice. Oh yeah. And then
spaghetti?
And then spaghetti, yeah.
Spaghetti on the rice.
Oh yeah. Everything. Japanese Americans, everything rice and lots of it. It's a good way to feed your kids.
So you have your rice and then spaghetti, and this the spaghetti still with the red sauce and everything?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It's Japanese American. You didn't know that about me? Yeah. Everything.
I know that rice is, but I just didn't know that spaghetti came into the picture.
Yeah. Think of any dish.
Any dish has
that Japanese Americans might eat. There's a fair amount of American food. It's always with just a ton of rice, and not just on the side. I would notice that other Americans, non-Japanese Americans, there'd be like the rice pilaf. It would be this tiny little thing of it, and I was like, that's totally different from for us. It's like essentially you have the plate, and then you have rice, and then you have food. It's just like, and then you eat the whole thing. Anyway, so when we would have this meal, which was frequent, one or more of us would end up going, "Oh, bay leaf," and we take the bay leaf. So
the one green in there.
So Mom, bay leaf is an herb, but you're supposed to take it out.
Sure.
It's supposed to flavor, and you take it out. We would go, "Oh, bay leaf," and my parents, particularly my mom, would say, "Oh, that means you get good luck now." And so in our family, it was like, "Hey, I got the bay leaf, yay!" So anyway, we investigated. We asked my mom about it. She's like, "Oh yeah, I just made that up because I didn't want to fish them out." So anyway, my point is that it's like, you got screwed. I'm just going to make up this story that this is a blessing because I don't know what else to do.
Except it's even more like, a mom cooks the dinner, the spaghetti for the family, and has shards of glass randomly in there. One of the kids eats and cuts, and the mouth is bleeding. And it's like, ah! It's like, were you acting too hungry? You were acting too hungry, weren't you? But the good news is, if you weren't acting too hungry, then now you get the lucky glass, boon because you got the glass. And that's what's happening with these folk. They're basically getting told that the worst possible thing was their fault. And in the teeny unlikely event it wasn't, they still got something good out of it.
Right. And I'm glad you point out that it would be this very unlikely asterisk that the person or people evaluating them would determine that they're not at fault, because there's always something that you can point to, right?
Yeah.
And it could be anything. Maybe that year you did everything perfect, but remember last year when you wore those socks that were too worldly or anything, especially when you're in that high control environment. And I've heard, unfortunately, from a lot of ex-cult members of this cult and other cults that will say that the indoctrination is so complete that and the control is so high that you just always know that you're to blame, and even if you can't identify it. So it's a massive asterisk for those people to say like, well, if you were pure and you were perfect, it's actually a gift from God. That's the end of this story. There's no like treatment or understanding, or
because you can imagine how the conversation goes if the person approaches someone, they're in tears. It's like, well, remember, what did you do? Right. And then after all of that, at the end, if the person's still kind of like not quite agreeing, it's like, well, also keep in mind you probably got some good spiritual growth out of it.
Right. Well, again, it's not growth because
it's a spiritual boon.
Right. Because growth implies there's a process of growing, but there's no.
You got some extra XP.
You got a token of God's goodwill, I think, or something. Yeah. So I want to remind people that this material is from the textbooks in the homeschooling program. This isn't just a pamphlet. This isn't some lecture given by. This is in the official teachings of this homeschool program. It's in black and white. I read it, and it is taught to literally every child by the parents, by the way.
Yeah.
Mind-blowing. Okay. So there's a lot of other stuff, but I wanted to paraphrase some bits because I think it's worth it. So this is just a paraphrase. I'm saying it as if it's written in the book, but it's really just my paraphrasing. Americans like to think our government is of the people, but that denies our biblical roots. Look at the governments of ancient Greece and Rome. They were based on the people also, and now they're just ruins. Also, look at the Soviet Union. They weren't based on God, which naturally leads to a tyrant. Berto, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so this is a very common argument, again, in the billions of hours of debates that I've gone through. That essentially, if you don't base your government or your society on the religious principles, and specifically the Christian ones, the Christian Bible, it will lead to ruin of your society. And so then they cite examples. They'll cite the 20th century wars. They'll cite societies like the Roman society that collapsed, etc. Yeah, that's a very common thing. It's an easy point to make, I think, because easy as in you can say, hey, you remember how the Roman Empire fell? They weren't Christians. It's like an easy soundbite you can point to.
Yeah, and it's often all that you need to say, particularly because there's no outside influence. That makes sense, and so let's move on in life.
Right.
And also just that line of that Americans like to think our government is of the people. That's a bad thing to the IBLP. That government is of the people.
Right.
No, it's not of the. It's of God. It's of the Bible. Right. What are you talking about?
Yeah.
So another paraphrase here is, it's godly to keep things clothed, like your body and the earth. God clothed the earth and trees, so we need to preserve the forests. In 1912, Robert Scott and his team of explorers died in Antarctica of hypothermia. So Robert Scott and his fellow explorers, it's kind of a famous case where they got wrecked, or their ship got caught in ice in Antarctica, and there's been a couple of movies about it or something. So there's a whole section on them and some pictures of them. In 1912, Robert Scott and his team of explorers died in Antarctica of hypothermia because they weren't clothed enough. So not only did God clothe the earth in trees, and so we need to clothe ourselves sufficiently, but also Robert Scott died of hypothermia in Antarctica. So that's a reason why you girls can't wear shirts that show your elbows. I mean, that's quite a leap, right? I mean, there's probably lots of other stories about people who were too hot and weren't allowed, they couldn't take off their clothes, and they died of heat exhaustion or something, like, what are you talking about?
Right. So basically it's this kind of very, very childish, simplistic presentation. Hey, trees are kind of like clothes, and they're all over the earth, right? So, although actually, hold on, because I need to adjust that, because it is okay to deforest trees and use all the oil. So never mind. But and people die of hypothermia. Therefore,
I mean, even the trees thing, it's like, well, there are deserts
and oceans, and the oceans cover most of the earth. So, but the water is the clothing.
And you even identify Antarctica, of which there are no trees. So,
can we use see-through clothing, because the water is see-through?
Yeah. So can I just put clothing on my face and then have water on the rest of my body, and some sand over here? What are you saying? So another section, the last bit I want to point to, which is notable, is that the book is very much trying to brainwash the students about a lot of things. But one of the things that's trying to brainwash them, I think this was in an older section, like in a teenage section, they're trying to brainwash the students about opinion polls. So they provided famous examples of how polls are wrong sometimes. And it seems pretty clear that, well, why do you think they'd be trying to point this out? You know, it's not like these research methods are more likely to get at what is likely to be representative of the group. It's just a whole section on how polls are wrong, and here are some famous cases. Why do you think they'd be doing that?
My guess is because if you start looking at statistics and studies of what people believe and don't believe, and you think that that is supposed to represent truth in some way, that is a major threat to the cult. If, for example, there are surveys that talk about whether people think it's right for the man to have certain rights, or if it's right for a woman to not this and that, and you look at that data and you believe it, you might start questioning, like, well, wait a minute, most people in the world apparently don't agree with. So in general, you got to discredit those things. That way you can't be like pointing at them. Or if someone brings those up, you're like, yeah, you can't trust those polls.
Right. Yeah, it was, again, maddening to me to look at, because I knew it was propaganda and extremely one-sided and not convincing to me. But the way it is laid out, and considering that these kids are homeschooled and they can't even go on the internet,
right?
That I would imagine it would be so convincing,
yeah.
You know?
But
because the thing is they're not saying lies. They're actually pointing to famous times when the polls, and not recent, you know, it's not like they talked about, everyone thought Donald Trump was going to lose. You know, they talk about famous cases from longer ago that are not as politicized today. You know, it's just like things you and I would be like, oh yeah, there was that famous case. It's really both maddening and genius that they wove factual information and compelling information, because it is a good argument. Like if you did a presentation about how you as a student should interpret polls in the future, this would be a part of it, but it wouldn't be the only part of it. There would be a lot of other parts to it. So it carries with it this convincing factualness of it.
What I can't tell is whether they're trying too hard or whether they succeeded, because you see how starting in 2015, Trump starts saying, you can't trust the media. The media is always lying to you. You can't trust the media. The media is always lying to you. And then a few years later, there's a whole millions and millions of people who, when asked, like, they'll say, like, yeah, no, I can't trust the media. The media is always lying to us. So, of course, I don't believe that he's getting indicted. Or if he is, I don't believe the reasons. Or if I do, whatever, right? And that didn't require any of these clever textbooks.
Right.
But I wonder if this and other things like it for decades have primed a lot of portion of our population to basically believe things like this and not trust things like that, you know?
Right. And I don't know if Trump and these other people know this, but the thing that they're tapping into, the cognitive bias they're hacking into, is that we are emotional creatures. So when we want to believe something, we figure out a way. So like for Donald Trump to say the press is fake, they're all dumb, you know, and of course he would privilege certain news outlets, but you could argue that he sent a message that it's all stupid.
Yeah, you can't trust anything but me.
Well, yes, but even if he didn't say that last part,
which he did, but
which he
even
did,
when he did
but if he didn't say it, you would think, okay, if I'm thinking logically, well, then he's dismantling his own venue to communicate with the public, you know, because you could argue he's a internet source, right? But what it does is when you dismantle the entire enterprise and you prime someone, say, okay, I reject everything I read on the internet, they know, or they benefit from the bias of the person saying, but there are some things that I want to believe. So when you feed me the information through the news or through yourself, I'll believe that, even though you said all the news is stupid, but I'll believe it because I want to. And because of the total rejection, if anything comes at them that is counter to that emotionally, then they will, like for me, they're, getting away from politics, there are scientific notions that I adhere to, whether it's in psychology or physics or astronomy or something.
Right.
And when new data comes out or there's some newsworthy study or finding and it's reported, because I have an understanding of critical thinking and how science works, and I've been through this enough times, and I have to remind myself, well, just because this contradicts what you believe doesn't mean you should reject it. In fact, you should actually pay more attention to it because it's likely that you're going to be more skeptical of it. So, and let's look into the background.
Right.
Where did the data come from? Who is the researcher? Is there follow-up studies? This kind of thing. And because I'm indoctrinated into that system, I can be more influenceable. People, not necessarily, but I'm more likely, because of that indoctrination, if you will, I'm indoctrinated into critical thinking, into the scientific method, and to the scientific community. Now, just because a scientist says something or just because science seems to be suggesting something doesn't mean that I necessarily, accept it, because it depends on the source and and the entirety of the data. But not that I'm not duped sometimes, I absolutely am. But that's a different indoctrination. It's a different system. It's a system that is more interested in the truth or the data or the empirical science and not as interested in a cult leader or a charismatic leader, right? So I'm saying all this to say that the further someone is pulled away from that, and the average American is already not within that mindset because they're not taught or they don't have the constant reminders that I do in my life. It's very easy to push them even further away from any kind of outside information or process or philosophy or practice that allows for scrutiny and questioning themselves, questioning their leaders, questioning their emotional impulses, questioning their emotional denial or acceptance of information, that kind of thing.
But right. And I am wondering more specifically about the 30% of the country that probably, if they're not part of IBLP, which obviously not 30% of the country is, but if IBLP is not the only system like this, right? There's so many similar ones. So if for the last many decades, there's been a lot of these kinds of models, which we know that there have been, it's not that surprising that they don't have any of those tools that you're mentioning. And not only do they not have those tools, the tools they do have are specially designed to not trust anything new.
Right. So there were some people that wanted us to talk about this book that's very prominent within IBLP about parenting, very influential book about parenting called To Train Up a Child, published in 1994. It was written and self-published by two Baptist parents named Michael Pearl and Debbie Pearl. And the book was heavily promoted by IBLP. So I want to talk about Michael Pearl. He's the main figure here. Born 1945, an American Baptist preacher. And when I look at him, the way that I would describe him, if someone were to ask me, who is that guy, I would say, well, Michael Pearl is a creepy old guy with a long white beard. It's my judgmental or description of him, which will make sense as we go through. So Michael Pearl, he became kind of well known for this book and his approach to parenting. And he was interviewed, for example, on Anderson Cooper, who really confronted him a lot. So, he's one of those figures. Okay. And his big thing is that he promotes corporal punishment. The book tells parents to, in my words, abuse children to, quote unquote, break their will. So that the break their will, break the child's will is written in the book.
That sounds like the Ruby gal.
Yes. Yeah. So Ruby Franke, also another very religious, isolated parent.
You got to break that stallion.
Yeah. So trigger warning, we're going to get into some specifics around physical abuse, particularly some of the children of the parents who actually adhered to this book, which are really horrific stories. But some things in here which I'm sure everyone can imagine. Of course, spanking is discussed pretty extensively. Beating children with objects, that's my phrase, but that's literally what they're talking about, is hitting children with implements, withholding food from them, like Ruby Franke was doing, spraying children with a cold garden hose, using cold baths, forcing children outside in cold weather. And here's another really So, the spanking, the beating with objects, withholding food, you're like, well, horrible, but, we've seen that sort of thing before.
Right.
Spraying children with cold garden hose, Using cold baths, Forcing children outside in cold weather, okay. But then here's one, hitting infants when they cry out for their parents. So this is a quote. This is a quote from the book that I'm going to read. If a father is attempting to make a child eat his oats, I'm going to make my child eat his oats. If a father is attempting to make his child eat his oats, and the child cries out for his mother, right. I don't want to eat my oats, then the mother should respond by spanking the child for whining for her and not eating his oats. He will then be glad to be dealing only with his father. Now, as a therapist who worked with a lot of families, and inevitably I gained a lot of competence in helping parents with parenting for kids of various ages, particularly 10 and up, but really of any age. Yeah, absolutely. Those moments are critical for the parents to work out in advance how they're going to approach that. Because what if the mom doesn't really care about the kid eating the oats? You got to talk about these things.
Yeah, when we've definitely run into, especially with my younger one, but even with the older one, a 12-year-old, 7-year-old, the 12-year-old will sometimes, but stop doing it because we would basically not respond the way she wanted, like ask twice, right? Like, can I do blah? And then say mom says no. Then unbeknownst to mom and unbeknownst to me that she asked, she comes downstairs and says, can I do blah? Now, when we hadn't caught on, I might say, okay. And then later, the dots are connected. The Three's Company episode resolves, and it's like, wait a minute. You had already asked, so no, now not only can you not do this, but actually, some privilege is taken or something, depending on the situation, right? The 7-year-old, same thing. It's like, but that one will do it just more in she doesn't even try to hide it. She'll just be like, Mama, can I do blah? No. Turn around. Daddy, can I do blah? I'm like, no, you already heard from your mama, right? So it's a very common thing from a child to try to play both sides. And as a parent, you absolutely need to spank them really hard. No, you need to say no. You can't play us like that.
Right.
But then you don't have to add the physical abuse.
Right. Here's another example, and this is one that is really out there. During breastfeeding, so, the child is an infant. During breastfeeding, if the baby bites the mother's nipple, you need to pull the baby's hair or pinch them or something that indicates that is unpleasant. So you need to indicate to the child that, that's unpleasant.
But pull the hair?
Yeah. So it says this in the book, and he talks about this too. During breastfeeding, so we're not talking about a defiant 7-year-old who won't eat her oats, okay? We're talking about an innocent baby who isn't biting because the child wants to be a dick.
No.
It's because it is
a reflex.
And as teeth start to develop, right, they don't even know they have teeth. They're just continuing to gum things, And I don't even know if they're talking about actual teeth. But during breastfeeding, if the baby bites the mother's nipple, you need to pull the baby's hair or pinch them.
Right. And I think their thinking is like, you need to send a message to that infant that their pain that they're inflicting will be met with pain.
Right. It completely misunderstands human development. You can't train a baby.
Oh my gosh.
They're not aware. They won't connect those things. The only thing, because the baby would have to know, I'm going to now bite. I want to bite.
Right. And what's worse is that if they, depending on the age, if they do start connecting the dots, what they'll start connecting is, I see, this is a dangerous environment.
Right. Yeah, right. So there are lessons that they'll learn, but it won't be that.
Yeah.
Including the one with the oats.
Yeah.
What they learn, because, there's an approach that a united front, even if the other parent, it depended, but the thing that I taught was that, okay, if you see your fellow parent, your co-parent, doing something that is egregiously wrong or beyond a certain threshold, and you think to yourself, well, but I'm supposed to have a united front. There are options of stepping in gracefully, right, and having maybe a code word to your fellow parent of just like, I'm going to take over. I don't want to undermine you, but I'm going to fucking undermine you because you're freaking out and you're crossing some lines.
Right.
But those are rare, hopefully. In most circumstances, even if you're like, that's not how I would do it, but we'll talk about it later. That's what I say is like, if you can, just table it in your mind and then you talk about it later, but don't intervene in that. Don't argue about parenting in front of the kids. You know what I mean? So
we used to be, me and my wife, we used to be really bad about this. Not all the time, but like when especially our first child was very little, man, we would not be good about it, where it'd be like, you can't do that, and you're like, literally like, you can't do that, that's wrong parenting, whatever, like, and we just have like these arguments, and it took us a while to realize that was not healthy for anyone, but as a positive example, just this last weekend, my older daughter was asking for a sleepover with a friend. But it was it wasn't the night before school started, but it was getting to where we only had one more day. So the mom, my wife, said, no. Now, in my head, I was going like, what? Why not let them? But, I let her lay the ground rule and say no. And then I didn't contravene that. Like, so it was one of those cases where it's not a bad thing. She's saying no to a sleepover. But in my head, I'm like, well, I probably would have said yes, but it doesn't benefit us for me to like contradict what she's doing. And that took a while to learn.
I mean, especially in a situation like that, because say you talk with your wife behind closed doors, you're like, and say you make your case and say she's convinced. Your wife is like, oh, okay, well, and then your wife can go to the kid and say, you know what, I changed my mind. That's a much different thing than you going to your kid and saying, you know what,
let me talk to mom.
So anyway, pretty off. It's like spank your kid. But I just want to highlight that they are prescribing abusing a baby, an innocent, pure, little, fragile baby. Who is just trying to get through the day, and makes a very innocent mistake.
Like pull the hair?
Not even a mistake. Just
pull the hair.
Just an innocent, unfortunate aspect of breastfeeding, that happens.
We know how painful pulling of the hair is.
Yeah, or pinching. Pinching a child. What kind of person, okay, spanking a child, I'm not saying it's okay, but in terms of, I guess, my spectrum here, spanking a child for openly defying a parent and asking for the other parent, not what you should do, but on the spectrum, I don't know where it is, but it's far below pinching and pulling the hair of an innocent baby who doesn't know what they're doing and clamps down. Like, what kind of monster do you have to be, right? And this isn't some fringe book. This was a book that was held up by IBLP, heavily promoted, and influenced millions of parents, including one of our listeners, by the way.
Yeah.
So,
and by the way, I could almost see them trying to defend, well, no, let me demonstrate what I mean. Like, okay, so that's happening. So what I do is I kind of pull, whatever, right? But even that's still not good. But even if they're writing this book, no one's going to interpret it the same way. And there's plenty of parents that'll be like, oh, okay,
right. Which is exactly what we're going to get into in a second. Also, the book basically claims if the children don't respond well to the punishments that you're giving out, the parents need to make the punishments more severe.
Right.
Until you break your child.
Yeah, that's the Ruby thing.
Yeah.
There is no limit in truth.
Right. This is not something that this guy made up, Michael Pearl, or Ruby Franke. It's something that has been in our society for a long time. It's just promoted by this book and claimed by many of the churches that adhered to IBLP as the godly way to, because it wasn't just like, this is what will help you to get control of your kid. I mean, that was, probably what was, what it was sold as, but it's also how you're going to save your child from hell, how you're going to get your kid into heaven, because it all leads up to when they're a teenager or an adult and they start making choices, you need to be in total control. And I know many of you know this, but just to be Captain Obvious for a second, is that research shows that when you enact this kind of control, parenting, but also other kinds of control, whether it's at work or other kinds of social environments where there's authority. It's well researched, well understood, found through dozens of angles that, yes, you might actually establish control and obedience of the people that are receiving the abuse, but they're not following the rules because they want to. They're following the rules out of terrorizing fear. And as a result of that terrorizing fear, there are a lot of other consequences, like they never are able to feel safe in the world in any situation. They don't know their own feelings. They don't know their emotions. They're psychologically stunted in a lot of ways, or in a constant state of anxiety and fight or flight. Or the other side, what you'll see is massive anger and rebellion because it just becomes too much for these individuals at some point in their life. So you might temporarily, if you go on a campaign to do this kind of thing, you might see in your 4-year-old less rebellion or less annoying behaviors, but you'll also see the child shutting down, the child turning away from you, the child doesn't want to bond with you. And of course, if you have 20 kids, you might not even notice that, right?
Yeah.
So it's really depressing to think about not only all the people that are abused in the world and not only all the people that are abused in the United States, but that it was prescribed under the charismatic leader and also all the ministers and all these various churches, that it was, that you can imagine there would be a set of parents that was not going in this direction, but then were told they needed to and then did it. It's one thing if the parents were going to do it anyway. It's just like, it's not great, but whatever. But there were probably tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of parents who would not have done this or wouldn't have been this severe, and they adopted this because it was being shoved down their throat.
Yeah.
It's demoralizing, because for me in my field, we start our days, our careers, our lives with trying to make the world a better place. One of the things that a lot of people are putting a lot of effort into, I put a lot more effort into this in my past because I worked more with families in the beginning of my career, specifically families that were abusing their kids. CPS would actually call me and pay for me to go into the house and try to end the abuse. We do it for our job, but we also are trying to stop the abuse, and to have this, it's like trying to hold back the water from the dam by, there's like all these
putting the little fingers in
it feels like you fight and you do what you can, and then stuff like this comes out and you hear about this. Jeez. And it's just like, how are we supposed to combat this?
Yeah, you're standing there and then there's a whole other dam that just broke on you're not even next to.
Yeah. Or I've been underwater the whole time, like I've just been deluding myself that somehow the world is getting to be better for children. Now, empirically, the world does seem to be getting for children, but a lot of these things were happening and are still to this day. There's still a lot of people who read this book and follow it, actually. So to give you an idea, there's an Amazon review that I just pulled off Amazon, someone who gave the book a five. The book, on average, it's like a 3.5 star, which isn't great, but it's all 5 stars and 1 stars.
Oh, okay.
And there's I think there's a lot of people that aren't really readers of the book, but know about it and are leaving bad reviews.
I see.
Most of the people that read the book are actually giving it 5 stars, and this is one of them. I'm glad that Amazon.uk is holding up free speech and is selling this book. Michael Pearl is writing how to successfully raise a child. Our parents and generations grew up like this. And who will doubt that those generations were great generations? Make America great again.
Yeah.
But look at us now today. Mentally degenerated, no purpose in life, crime-ridden. The youth is a mess, knows no boundaries, respects no one. And nearly all families are broken. Why? A lack of God's word and a lack of disciplining children. Not, quote-unquote, beating them up, as the hate-filled Amazon spammers suggest, but by lovingly disciplining them the way the Bible tells over and over again. Just one example from Proverbs 29:15, quote, the rod and reproof give wisdom. The rod and reproof give wisdom. I don't know what reproof means. It must be some kind of like a verbal punishment or something.
Yeah.
The rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child left to himself bringeth his mother to shame. Just the mother.
Yeah. I mean, so what's interesting is the fathers and the grandfathers' generation was great, and they were beat. Not beat, lovingly beat. So what happened? What happened? Because if the chain was unbroken, what happened? How did the chain break? Why is this generation not good? Were we not beat? Oh, it's because we were not beat. But if we were not beat, it means our parents, who were good people, didn't beat us. Why didn't they beat us? Weren't they supposed to beat us? What happened to them that they didn't beat us? Like, the logic breaks down immediately, right? It's like this simplistic notion, like, well, the past is always better. And I see our parents and our grandparents were better people because they were beat. But now we're not because we weren't beat by the people that I just said were better people.
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. And even the notion that the generations before us were more compliant is not borne out in the data. It certainly is through rose-colored glasses, the way that we look at the past, maybe even those people who lived the past. But it's hard to test that, right?
No, that makes a lot of sense because the Civil War happened now, right? And the French Revolution happened now.
Yeah.
And all the wars and all the conflict from the compliant people that didn't raise revolutions or rebellions, that was all now.
Yeah. Yeah. So now, trigger warning. I'm going to describe in detail 2 of the 3 cases that have been reported on of children dying because of parents who were following this book specifically.
Jeez.
So skip forward a while if you don't want to hear those details. And I apologize for the past. Some of the patrons were saying, like, when I was talking about Twilight Zone and those kind of tragedies, I didn't say trigger warning, which I should have, because I think I was trying to shock you, because I knew you could handle it. By the way, these were all homeschooled children, maybe not IBLP, but very much like the IBLP kids. So the first kid is Lydia Schatz. So she was born in 2002, and she was a 7-year-old American child from Liberia, adopted by parents in rural California. So I don't know at what age she was adopted, but at the time of her death, she was 7 years old.
Oh my God.
So killed in 2010 as they were attempting to discipline her. And here's the incident. So they whipped her with a 1/4-inch plastic tube. By the way, this is specifically prescribed in Michael Pearl's book. He says to use a plastic tube that is a 1/4 of an inch wide. And on the surface, you might think, well, it's not like a bat, but just listen to the rest of this. So she was held down for 9 hours by the mother while the father beat her repeatedly with the 1/4-inch plastic tube. And we can recall the principle that put forth by Michael Pearl, that if the child continues to break the rules,
you go more extreme.
So if you're telling a kid to shut up or stop crying or whatever, and this doesn't even take into account the massive amounts of attachment trauma that this kid went through. Probably, I don't know, but if the child was adopted, post 6 months, then there's going to be some issues there potentially, not always, but and the fact that the kid's I think black, living in rural California, God knows. But anyway, so she was being held down for 9 hours. The book doesn't talk about limits. It doesn't, it does try to say, don't beat your kids. There is some lip service to that, but it also says, keep amping it up, and so anyway, she was being disciplined for apparently mispronouncing a word, though, Berto. So, So, when you hear an issue like holding a child down for 9 hours, you're not looking at a normal set of parents to begin with, right?
No.
So you would also expect that there would be discipline for things you wouldn't think a child would be disciplined for. So it seems as though these parents were bad to begin with, sadistic or psychopathic or problematic or something in some way. But the book influenced them and gave them permission or pushed them even more down that road or something. Because I'm guessing the average reader of this book wouldn't have done this. But anyway, her sister, Zariah, 11 years old, was also beaten for, quote, being a liar and a bad influence on the 7-year-old. And she was hospitalized in critical condition with severe injuries, but she actually survived. So, when you hear critical condition, that's serious. It's not just like a broken bone or some bruises.
She was near death.
Right. So, once the child is deceased, there's an investigation, thank goodness, and the parents are charged. And during the trial, the father was found guilty of second-degree murder and torture and was sentenced to 2 concurrent life sentences with a 22 years minimum. So,
I normally don't condone sentencing someone to be beaten with a tube made out of plastic, rubber, whatever. But this is one of those times that I would.
Yeah.
Just, and just ask every 10 minutes, is this cool? Are you liking it? And if the answer is anything but yes, then you just do it more.
Right. Yeah.
And if the answer is yes, you do it more.
Yeah.
I mean, the sad thing, as I say that, in reality, is that, it's quite possible. I mean, that maybe that person was a psychopath out of nowhere, but it's quite possible they were severely beat as well when they were kids. Who knows what damage they had in their head. The whole thing is such a tragedy. But the fact is that something influenced them on top of whatever they already had going.
Right. Yeah. The mother was found guilty of voluntary manslaughter and infliction of unlawful corporal punishment and was sentenced to 13 years. Michael Pearl was attacked by the media and people saying that you influenced this, right? Because there was a lot of criticism about the book anyway, and then this happens, and he responded to the news about Lydia dying. He argued that him being a factor in the murder of Lydia was not objectionable because his children became, quote unquote, his children, his own children, became, quote, entrepreneurs that pay the taxes your children will receive in entitlements.
But wait, hold on. We were driving down a road, and now we just veered off into the ditch, and I don't understand which way we're facing.
So he's speaking to the people that are attacking him.
I know, right? So the people attacking him say that
your book is
right.
Preaching abuse of children.
The fact that my book is mentioned here is not a bad thing.
Right.
Because my kids pay taxes.
Right. And your
lazy ass
will receive entitlements, welfare,
because you're
government payouts.
Likely black and you're poor
or you're liberal or something.
I'm sure there's racism in that statement.
Yeah.
Because the little girl was apparently not white, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I hadn't thought about that there
wow, yeah, no, just wonderful all around.
Yeah. That's his public statement.
Yeah. but that was on top of the empathy about the victim.
I mean, maybe, but
I don't know.
It's hard to imagine that the empathy goes very deep, given that he would say that sort of thing, Anyway, so the second child I want to talk about, her name is Hannah Williams, born in 1997, another adopted child, this child from Ethiopia, by an American family living in Sedro-Woolley, Washington.
Yeah.
Do you know where Sedro-Woolley is?
No.
I think it's north of Seattle.
Oh, geez.
It's a small town in Washington State. And she died in 2011 of hypothermia.
Oh.
So just as Michael Pearl recommends, Hannah was regularly spanked, locked in a closet, denied food as punishment, not allowed to wear clothes, forced to sleep in a barn, and take showers with a garden hose. And, I want to remind people that time she died, she would have been 12 or 13 or something. So the amount of years that she went through being spanked and beaten and locked in a closet, denied food, not allowed to wear clothes, forced to sleep in a barn, taking showers with a garden hose. Okay. So the mother was convicted of homicide by abuse, and first-degree assault of a child and was sentenced to 37 years in prison. The father was convicted of first-degree manslaughter and first-degree assault of a child and was sentenced to 27 years in prison.
Wait.
And
how is it a limit on that sentence? I don't understand. By the way, 27 years, but when they get out, they've lost their license to have kids, right?
Yeah. The description here in the news reporting is so much more graphic, right?
No, I mean,
and so heartbreaking.
Like, I don't understand.
Yeah.
Yeah, just like, what drives me insane about this is, it's likely the same crowds that are going crazy over QAnon and how children are getting harmed all over the world and all this stuff.
Yeah. Now, I'm sure the vast majority of children who were raised by parents influenced by this book, they didn't die, right? But so this is the tip of the iceberg, right? The kids that die are the ones that the abuse was severe enough or in a way that was such that it resulted in the murdering of a child. But just think about all the millions of other kids who were being treated this way, and it didn't result in death. Because, you
right.
could imagine that, the kinds of things that are...
That's severe abuse still, severe damage, physical, emotional, everything.
Torture.
Yeah.
There's a pretty good chance that with Lydia, that the parents had held her down before and beaten her before for maybe 8 hours at a time or something. And think about all the other kids who have been through that sort of parenting and been through that sort of abuse and torture. And then, that's horrible. It's another thing, or it's further painful and torturous to know that this is coming from a book that's kind of mainstream in your community.
Yeah.
And
from a pastor.
Right, that it's considered to be a wonderful book, and the parents are saying, "Look, I'm doing what's in here."
It's so horrible. Like there's few things more horrible than hearing about like these tortures of little children, inspired by a pastor writing a book about torturing children.
Yeah. Also, to rub salt in our wounds, Berto, is that his publishing house or whatever, his organization, because he also is hired to do a lot of speaking. It's a non-profit organization, so they don't pay federal taxes.
Of course they don't. Yeah.
Yeah.
What about at least putting warnings or having to like link books that contradict the material or like...
Well, what I would hope is that a book like this would not be popular to begin with, because if you did get rid of this book, it's not like the practices would go away.
Right.
Right.
But since it's impossible to control sometimes what gets popular, I still think like there should be some responsibility on the side of the publishing companies as well as the distributing companies to offer more information to people.
Yeah.
Like, why not? You have the book. Say, and by the way, there are 3 deaths associated with,
Yeah.
Like,
what would I do? I would, one, just not have it on my site. But I think another thing you could do is you could mention that. But you could also mention more detailed information about the research on using corporal punishment and this kind of torture on kids. Like, because that's the more salient point. It's like the whole idea of this book is actually not in service of what you want.
Right.
What you're trying
and that's
to
what
do
I'm saying,
is
like offer books that contradict the thing or data, because sites have had to do this for things like when you go on YouTube or Facebook or whatever, sometimes they have to say, hey, these are not facts.
Like Joe Rogan having to have a disclaimer that he doesn't know what he's talking about when he talks about vaccines and science and stuff. Yeah. Yeah. Well, on that depressing note, Berto, let's take a break, and when we get back, let's adjourn chapter 13 of the Duggar deep dive. This will be our final chapter. And the final chapter.
It's the final chapter. Do-do-do-do.
And in the patron zone, we're going to go over the allegations I'm going to summarize the allegations against IBLP and Bill Gothard. The documentary Shiny Happy People went into a little bit of it, but didn't go into enough of it. In fact, we talked about in an earlier chapter
quickly.
and it was unconvincing to me for the most part. I remember...
Right, it was like he did something?
Yeah, there were some specifics that were identified by some of the victims, but when you learn the actual accounts and the court documents, people that are stating these allegations for the record, it's way worse than the documentary made it seem, to me anyway. Yeah. So we're going to do that. And then we're also going to talk about, we're going to answer the question, is IBLP a cult? Because I have over the years developed my own criteria based on other systems of evaluating cults. Because we often talk about it, and I have been identifying it as a cult, but is it really a cult? Can it be categorized that way? We can't just throw that word around willy-nilly. Yeah. So let's get into that in the patron zone. And so become a patron if you want to hear the rest of this. And if you don't want to become a patron, that's also fine with me. Hurts me a little bit, but but no, it's fine. Especially, money is tight right now. So become a patron if you want to hear the rest of this. And otherwise, please take care of yourself because
you deserve it.